Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're opening up a file that has been sitting in the cold case archives for roughly 1,400 years.
It really is one of those files. It's a case that sits right at the uncomfortable, often contentious intersection of, well, neurology, medieval history, and theology.
It's a real minefield. And we're looking at a question that has been asked, whispered in back rooms, sometimes shouted from pulpits, and debatably diagnosed in medical journals for centuries.
That's a very persistent question.
The central question is this: did the Prophet Muhammad suffer from epilepsy? Specifically, did he have what we now call temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE?
And of course, the big follow-up question that always comes with it, was this medical condition the actual source of his visions and ultimately the Quran?
It's a massive claim. It's essentially the materialist theory of revelation. And today, we aren't just speculating or, throwing opinions around.
No, we have a guide. We are walking through a very dense, very specific rebuttal. We're doing a deep dive into the book Prophet Muhammad, the Epilepsy Allegation, a medical and historical refutation by Yusuf Jamal, which was published in 2025.
So before we get into the weeds, tell us a bit about our guide for this journey. Who is Yusuf Jamal?
So Jamal is interesting because he bridges the gap that usually exists in these debates. He's a former head of physiology.
Okay, so he's coming at this from a hard science background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He isn't approaching this purely as a theologian trying to defend a dogma, nor is he a historian just looking at, dusty scrolls. He's looking at it as a guy who knows how neurons fire, how the brain's electrical systems actually work.
Right.
His whole argument is that you can't just throw around medical terms like epilepsy to explain historical events without checking if the symptoms actually fit the disease. You have to do the clinical workup, even if it's 1,400 years late.
So the mission here is to take this epilepsy allegation, put it on the operating table, so to speak, and dissect it using three tools.
Right. Modern neurology, first and foremost. Then, primary historical eyewitness accounts.
Right.
What did the people who were actually there say?
And third.
And third, a bit of literary analysis of the Quran itself, the product of the alleged episodes.
And just to set the stage, the author, Yusuf Jamal, is very clear about his stance. He is writing this to refute the claim.
He is. But he argues that his refutation is rooted in evidence, hard medical and historical facts, rather than just emotion or faith. Our job today is to report on his findings impartially and see how he builds that case step by step.
Then I want to set the stakes early here. This isn't just about a diagnosis of a historical figure. As Jamal points out, if you buy the epilepsy theory, you have a massive logistical problem to solve.
The high-functioning problem, I think that's the best way to put it.
And exactly. You have to explain how a person with untreated chronic epilepsy, and we have to stress in the 7th century with no medication, could lead armies.
Right. No anti-seizure meds.
Draft constitutions, manage a fledgling state, and produce incredibly complex literature over a 23-year period.
That is the hook right there, isn't it? Can pathology explain high performance? Or are they, at some point, mutually exclusive? Fascinating question.
So let's get into it. Section 1 of our stack here is called the anatomy of an allegation. Where does this idea even come from? I assume it didn't start with modern neurologists looking at MRI scans.
No, definitely not. Jamal takes us way back. The backstory, as he calls it, shows that criticism of the Prophet Muhammad is as old as his mission. But in the beginning, it wasn't medical in the way we understand it today.
So what was it?
Well, when he first started preaching in Mecca, the locals didn't say, oh, he has temporal lobe epilepsy. They didn't have that vocabulary, that framework.
So what did they call him then? What was the accusation?
They threw everything at the wall to see what would stick. They called him a poet. They called him a sorcerer. And very frequently, they called him Majnun.
Majnun. Okay, that translates to madman, right? Or possessed.
Technically, yes, madman. But the etymology is really important here. Majnun comes from the root word jinn. It literally means one who is possessed by jinn or spirits.
I see. So it's a supernatural diagnosis.
It's completely a supernatural diagnosis. In 7th century Arabia, if someone acted strangely, recited poetry that seemed to come from nowhere, or claimed to see things others couldn't, you didn't check their serotonin levels or look for brain lesions.
You assumed a spirit had hijacked them.
Exactly. So the earliest accusation wasn't his brain is broken, it was he's a vessel for an unseen force. It's a very different worldview. This also extends to other traditions. Jamal mentions the medieval Jewish derogatory term for him was hamashuga, which again means the madman.
Okay, so originally it was about possession. When did the shift happen? When did it become a medical critique? When did it become the falling sickness?
That shift really starts to take shape with Byzantine and medieval Christian polemicists. These are writers who are trying to make sense of and, frankly, combat this new rising power of Islam.
It's a political threat to them.
A huge one. And Jamal highlights a historian named Theophanes in the 8th century. Theophanes is writing for a Christian audience that is, frankly terrified of this new Islamic empire expanding so rapidly.
And what does he claim?
He claimed that Muhammad had epilepsy, and this is a fascinating detail, that his wife, Khadija, was from a noble family and was embarrassed by it. She was mortified to be married to a man with this condition.
So how does that story play out?
So the theory Theophanes puts forward is that Muhammad invented the angel Gabriel's story to cover up his seizures, to save face with his wife.
I'm not sick, dear. I'm being visited by an angel. That's a clever narrative spin for that time period.
It's an incredibly effective polemic. It reframes the entire religion as a cover-up for a physical defect. It's a way of saying this isn't divine, it's just a man trying to hide his shameful illness.
And that idea carries on.
It does. You see it echoed much later by figures like Archdeacon Humphrey Prideaux in the 17th century. He wrote a very famous anti-Islam polemic, and he described the revelations as a trance that was faked to hide his falling sickness.
So at this stage, it's not really a diagnosis, it's an insult, it's a tool.
It's a polemic, 100%. It's a way to say, don't listen to this guy, he's a fraud, and he's sick.
Yeah.
The goal isn't medical accuracy, it's delegitimization.
But the real pivot, the moment it tries to put on a lab coat and sound like science, is the Orientalist era, right? We're talking the 19th and 20th century.
Right, the colonial era scholars, people like Dr. Alois Springer, William Muir, and David Margoliouth. These guys are, children of the Enlightenment. They're operating in a very different intellectual climate.
They don't really believe in demonic possession anymore.
No, that's medieval superstition to them. But they also, as secular or Christian academics, don't believe in divine revelation.
So they are stuck in the middle. They need a third option, an explanation that is neither divine nor demonic.
Precisely. They need to explain the phenomenon of the Quran and the rise of Islam without God and without the devil. And that's where the new tool comes in. Pathological materialism.
Pathological materialism. That is a heavy phrase. Let's unpack that.
It basically means trying to explain spiritual or religious phenomena as a biological glitch. It's a reductionist approach.
So you take something extraordinary and reduce it to the ordinary.
Exactly. They stopped saying he is possessed by a demon and started saying his brain is misfiring. They looked at the same historical accounts, the descriptions of sweating, the heaviness, the intensity during revelation, and they put on their 19th century medical goggles.
And then what did they see?
They said, aha, that looks like hysteria. That looks like epilepsy. They medicalized the critique. It was a way to dismiss the content of the revelation by pathologizing the source.
And that brings us to the modern version of the accusation, which is much more specific. The book uses a particular article as a test case, right? A piece by Sam Shamoun.
Yes, and Shamoun's work is a good example of how these 19th century theories get recycled and updated with modern terminology. He collects various descriptions from the Islamic traditions, the hadith.
What kind of descriptions?
Things like the prophet mentioning that revelation sometimes came to him like the ringing of a bell, or reports of him sweating profusely, even on cold days, or that he would appear to be in a trance-like state.
And Shamoun and others argue these are classic epilepsy symptoms.
Yes, but they narrow it down. The specific modern claim centers on TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy.
Why TLE specifically? Why not just generalized seizures, the grand mal type?
Because TLE is known in the medical literature to be associated with complex experiences. The temporal lobe handles memory, emotion, and sensory processing.
So it's the part of the brain that could, theoretically, produce visions.
Exactly. It can produce complex visual or auditory hallucinations, and sometimes intensely religious feelings, or what some neurologists have called hyperreligiosity. So for critics, TLE looks like a perfect fit. It seems to explain the visions and the powerful religious content of the experience.
Okay, so the prosecution has laid out its case. It's an old accusation that's been modernized. The claim is the prophet had seizures, specifically TLE, and those seizures produced the religion.
That's the argument in a nutshell.
So now, before we get to the defense, we need to go to Medical School 101. If we're going to evaluate this, we need to know what epilepsy actually is, clinically.
This is where Jamal's physiology background really comes in handy. He breaks it down using the ILA standards, that's the International League Against Epilepsy, We need to be precise here because the terms matter.
So what's the most basic definition we need to start with?
First, you have to distinguish between a seizure and epilepsy. They aren't the same thing.
Okay, how so?
A seizure is a single event. It's a temporary, abnormal, excessive surge of neuronal activity in the brain. Think of it like a brief electrical storm. Anyone can have a seizure under the right circumstances. High fever, head injury, etc.
But that's not epilepsy.
No. Epilepsy is the disease, the underlying condition where you have recurrent, unprovoked seizures. It's a predisposition to these electrical storms. So one seizure does not an epileptic make.
Got it. And within epilepsy, there are different types of seizures.
Two main categories we need to worry about for this discussion. First, you have generalized onset seizures. This is what most people picture when they hear the word seizure, what used to be called grand mal.
The dramatic ones you see in movies and on TV.
Right. The proper term is a tonic-clonic seizure, and the name tells you what happens. Tonic means the body goes stiff, all your muscles lock up. Clonic means the jerking, the rhythmic convulsions.
And in this type of seizure, you lose consciousness almost immediately.
Instantly. You
Yeah.
crash. You have no awareness of what's happening.
And the physical symptoms are pretty severe, right?
They're very violent and uncontrolled. You often hear the ictal cry. It's a weird, strangled sound as air is forced out of the lungs by the contracting chest muscles. It's not a scream of pain. It's a mechanical sound.
Okay.
Then there's often severe tongue biting, enough to cause bleeding. And very commonly, there's incontinence, losing control of the bladder or bowels. The person is completely out of it, and the body is just haywire.
That's a very clear, very specific set of symptoms. Now, what about the second type? The one central to the allegation.
That would be focal onset seizures. This is where the electrical storm starts in one specific part of the brain, a focal point. If it starts in the temporal lobe, that's temporal lobe epilepsy, or TLE.
And what does that look like? Is it as dramatic?
It's usually much subtler. It often starts with what's called an aura. The aura is actually part of the seizure itself. It's the beginning.
And what is an aura like?
It could be many things, depending on where in the temporal lobe it's happening. You might smell something that isn't there, like burning rubber. You might get a rising sensation in your stomach, like on a roller coaster drop. Or you could have psychic phenomena, like a very strong sense of déjà vu or jamais vu.
Jamais vu.
The opposite of déjà vu. A feeling that a familiar place or person is suddenly completely alien and strange.
Wow. Okay. And what happens after the aura?
You might then go into a state of impaired awareness. You wouldn't be convulsing on the floor, but you'd be checked out. You might stare blankly. And you often display automatisms.
Automatisms.
Yeah, they're repetitive, purposeless movements. Things like lip smacking, chewing motions, picking at your clothes, or fumbling with objects. The person is on autopilot and will have no memory of doing these things afterwards.
Okay, so those are the symptoms during the event. But the book emphasizes something that happens after the event, the postictal state. Why is this so crucial?
This is arguably the most important concept in the entire medical argument. After a significant seizure, especially a tonic-clonic one, but also after many focal seizures, the brain doesn't just snap back to normal. It's been through a major trauma.
It needs to reboot.
Exactly. That's the perfect analogy. This is the postictal state. The word ictal refers to the seizure itself, so postictal is after the seizure. Imagine your computer crashes from a power surge. It doesn't just instantly reappear at the desktop with all your programs running.
It has to run diagnostics, reload the operating system. It's slow.
Precisely. That's the brain after a seizure. Patients are almost always deeply confused, exhausted, and disoriented. They might have a splitting headache or muscle aches, and very often they have amnesia for the event and the time immediately before it.
How long does this state last?
It can last for minutes, or in many cases for hours. The brain is recovering. It's metabolically spent. You cannot perform high-level cognitive tasks during the postictal state. You're lucky if you know your own name.
So, to be clear, if the prophet was having epileptic seizures of any significance, we should expect to see this reboot phase in the historical record.
That is the medical baseline. Jamal argues that if you're going to diagnose epilepsy, you aren't just looking for the seizure itself. You are looking for the whole clinical picture. And the postictal state is a non-negotiable part of that picture. You don't just snap out of it.
Okay, that's a very clear framework. So let's move to section 3, the refutation. This is where we take that medical checklist and hold it up against the historical descriptions of the prophet's wahi, or revelation experiences.
Right. And we have to be fair to the critics here. The reason this theory has legs is because there were physical symptoms described during revelation. This isn't something invented by his enemies. It's in the Islamic sources.
What kind of symptoms?
Brockett would sweat, even on cold days. His face would become red. His body would become incredibly heavy, so heavy that one of his companions reported that the prophet's thigh was on his, and he felt like his own thigh was going to be crushed.
And there's the camel story.
Right. If he was riding a camel when revelation began, the camel would be forced to its knees by the sheer weight, and he would sometimes hear sounds, described metaphorically as like the ringing of a bell or the humming of bees.
So the critics look at that and say, aha, symptoms. That proves it.
But this is where Jamal argues it's a clinical mismatch. The symptoms don't actually line up with an epileptic seizure when you look closely. So let's go through the diagnostic checklist he lays out, starting with consciousness.
Okay. So in epilepsy, you lose it or it's impaired.
In generalized seizures, yes, you are completely unconscious. In focal seizures, your awareness is impaired. You might be staring blankly, unable to respond in that robotic, automatic state.
But what do the accounts of the prophet say?
They say he maintained full consciousness. He was aware of what was happening. It was an internal experience. He received the revelation. He understood it. And crucially, he could recall and dictate the voices immediately after the state passed.
So he wasn't blacking out. He was, for lack of a better term, logging in to a different state of awareness. But he was still aware.
Exactly. There are no reports of him being unresponsive or staring blankly. He was actively receiving information. And then we get to the smoking gun, as you mentioned, the post-event state.
The reboot. The postictal phase.
Right. In epilepsy, you have that profound confusion, that fog, that amnesia.
Yeah.
But the historical sources regarding the prophet describe the exact opposite. He would emerge from these intense physical states with immediate and total clarity.
No confusion. No asking, where am I?
Zero reports of confusion. No amnesia. He would instantly recite complex, eloquent, and often lengthy verses of scripture that he had just received. The physical strain would lift, and his mind would be, if anything, sharper than ever.
So he goes from a state of high physical stress directly into a state of high-functioning cognitive output.
Exactly. And Jamal, as a physiologist, points out that this is medically inconsistent with a postictal state. You don't come out of a seizure and instantly dictate a masterpiece of literature. You just don't. Your brain is in recovery mode.
Okay, what about the next point on the checklist? Physical control. You mentioned falling, jerking, and tongue biting earlier.
This is another major divergence. An epileptic seizure, particularly tonic-clonic, is violent and chaotic. You fall, often injuriously, you convulse, you might foam at the mouth or lose bladder control. It's a loss of all motor control.
Did the prophet ever experience anything like that?
The book says there are zero authentic reports of him falling injuriously, foaming at the mouth, or having incontinence during revelation. The heaviness described was a kind of stillness, a weight, but not a convulsion. He didn't thrash around. He was weighed down as if by an immense pressure. It's a very different physical description.
And the final point on this clinical checklist is consistency, or rather, the context of the episodes.
Right. Seizures are, by their nature, random. They are misfirings of neurons. They don't care what you're doing, what time of day it is, or what question you were just asked. They are chaotic biological events.
But the revelations weren't random.
Far from it. They were often incredibly context-specific. Someone would come to the prophet and ask a complex legal question about inheritance. A revelation would come with a specific, detailed answer. A major battle would finish, and a revelation would come analyzing the victory or defeat.
So a seizure doesn't wait for a question to be asked.
A seizure doesn't produce a coherent legal ruling on inheritance law in response to a specific dispute that just occurred. The timing, the relevance, and the content of the revelations argue strongly against a random electrical discharge in the brain.
That leads us perfectly into the next section, Section 4, the product of the episodes. We've talked about the physical symptoms not matching, but what about the output, the Quran itself?
This is what Jamal calls the cognitive complexity argument, and it's a very powerful one. The book poses a simple question. Can a disordered brain produce a masterpiece of structural and thematic coherence?
Now hold on. Some might argue that madness and creativity are linked. We've had artists with mental illness, right? Van Gogh, for example. Doesn't mental turmoil sometimes aid great art?
That's the mad genius trope, and it has some validity in expressive arts, absolutely. A painter might translate their inner turmoil onto a canvas, but Jamal draws a sharp distinction between expressive emotional art and highly structured, logical, legislative text.
What's the difference in this context?
We are talking about a text that was delivered orally over 23 years, which claims to be a unified legal, theological, and historical code. It's not a collection of abstract paintings. Jamal discusses the incredibly complex literary structure of the Quran. For example, it uses things like ring structures.
Wait, you're going to have to unpack ring structure for a second.
It's a sophisticated literary technique where the end of a passage mirrors the beginning and the core message is right in the center. So the structure might be A, B, C, then the central point D, and then it reverses CDA.
It's like a palindrome of ideas.
A palindrome of ideas, exactly. And to compose something like that orally, on the spot, requires immense high-level planning and cognitive control. Jamal argues that someone in a short-circuiting brain state, or who is recovering from a seizure, isn't going to be producing intricate chiastic structures. It's just not cognitively possible.
It's the difference between what neurologists call word salad and a perfectly structured sonnet.
Precisely. In states of psychosis or post-seizure confusion, you often get disordered speech. It's fragmented, it's incoherent, it might be repetitive in a nonsensical way. But the Quran is famous for its eloquence. Even the Prophet's worst enemies, the greatest poets of Arabia at the time, acknowledged its linguistic power.
You're talking about men who made their living from words.
The masters of the Arabic language, they called it magic, they called it sorcery, because they couldn't explain how an unlettered man like him could produce it, but they never ever called it gibberish. They knew it was something linguistically potent.
And that ties into the tahari, or the challenge that's mentioned in the Quran itself, doesn't it?
Yes. The Quran repeatedly challenges its listeners. If you think this is from a human, then produce a chapter like it. Jamal's argument is, if this text was the result of a medical pathology, a brain glitch, why couldn't the most eloquent, healthy poets of Arabia replicate it?
That's a strong point. If it's just a symptom of a disease, it shouldn't be inimitable. It should be, at some level, reproducible.
They should have been able to say he's just a sick man mumbling, we are the masters of language, we can do better. But they couldn't.
Yeah.
And they never claimed to. They claimed it was magic because they couldn't meet the challenge.
And beyond the structure, there's the content.
Absolutely, the subject mastery. The text covers law, inheritance, cosmology, history, military ethics, family law. These are domains that require high-level executive function and a coherent worldview.
Yeah.
You don't accidentally hallucinate a complete, mathematically sound inheritance law system that balances the rights of various family members. That's a product of ordered thought, not chaos.
Speaking of executive function, let's go to Section 5, the high-functioning defense. Because the prophet wasn't just a mystic sitting in a cave, he was a general, a diplomat, a judge, a head of state.
This is where the medical argument really hits a brick wall for Jamal. He distinguishes between prophethood and pathology. Chronic, untreated epilepsy, especially in the 7th century, is a debilitating condition. It takes a toll on the memory, on the personality, on your ability to function day to day.
But the prophet led armies.
He personally led over 20 military expeditions. Let's just think about the Battle of the Trench for a minute. That was a massive defensive siege of the city of Medina. You have 10,000 enemy soldiers at the gates.
And the defenders are outnumbered, starving.
Exactly. Starvation, fear, betrayal from within the city walls. This is the highest stress environment imaginable.
The ultimate stress test.
It is. And stress is a major trigger for seizures in people with epilepsy. So at the moment of greatest pressure, he should have been incapacitated.
But he wasn't.
Instead, he was the chief strategist. He's the one who... The Treaty of Hudaybiyah is a masterclass in strategic patience and long-term planning. He negotiates a treaty with his enemies in Mecca, and on the surface, the terms look humiliating for the Muslims.
His own followers were angry, right?
They were furious. Umar, one of his closest companions, was practically apoplectic. They wanted to fight, they felt he was giving everything away, but he held the line. He understood that the short-term concession of not entering Mecca that year would buy him a decade of peace, which would allow Islam to spread far more effectively than war ever could.
That is impulse control. That is seeing the whole chessboard.
It's the definition of high-level strategic thought. And what about his personality? You mentioned earlier that TLE can sometimes cause personality changes.
Yeah.
Yes, in the medical literature, chronic TLE is sometimes associated with something called Geschwind syndrome. Not all patients get it, but it's a known cluster of traits, including what's called a sticky personality. They can become obsessive, overly moralistic, hypergraphic, meaning they write excessively. Also sometimes increased aggression.
So does the prophet's personality profile fit that?
Not at all. In fact, Jamal highlights his incredible emotional intelligence and stability. The most famous example is the incident at the city of Taif.
But what happened there?
Early in his mission, he went to Taif to preach. The leaders mocked him, rejected him, and then set the street mobs on him. They stoned him until his shoes were filled with his own blood. He was chased out of the city, physically and emotionally broken. It was a moment of extreme trauma and humiliation.
Most people would snap. They'd be filled with rage and a desire for revenge.
Exactly. And according to the tradition, the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, God has seen what they've done to you. If you wish, I can command the mountains to crush this city.
And what was his response?
His response wasn't to lash out or have a breakdown. He chose forgiveness. He said no. Perhaps from their children will come a generation that worships God. He was consistently described by those who knew him best as calm, kind, often smiling, and socially adept. He navigated incredibly complex tribal politics without losing his cool.
So, the medical profile of a chronic, untreated TLE patient memory issues, personality changes, cognitive decline, it just doesn't match the historical profile of the man.
Jamal argues it's a complete incompatibility. You don't get the Constitution of Medina, which was a groundbreaking document establishing a pluralistic society with rights for Jews and other minorities, from a mind that is degenerating. It's a product of clarity, not confusion.
So the actions don't fit. The product doesn't fit. Let's talk about the witnesses. Section 6, eyewitness testimony. Because he wasn't living in isolation. People saw him every single day.
He lived his life in a fishbowl. He had his closest companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali. They were with him 24/7 in peace and in war. And they described him with reverence. Ali described him as the most truthful, the kindest.
And his household staff.
A man named Anas ibn Malik served him for 10 years from the time he was a boy. He later said, I served the Prophet for 10 years and he never said to me, "Uff," a sound of irritation, and never blamed me for anything I had done or not done. He saw only stability and cheerfulness.
And if he was falling down, foaming at the mouth, or losing control of his bladder?
His family would have known. His wives, especially Aisha, who was known for her sharp intellect and memory, would have known. They lived with him in the most intimate circumstances.
And they do report the physical signs of revelation.
Yes, they report the sweating, they report the intensity, the heaviness, but they never, ever reported pathology. They never described him as sick in that way. They saw it as an intense spiritual experience, not a medical episode.
But what about his enemies? This is the part of the argument from the book that I find most compelling, the foes.
This is a crucial point from the text, the argument from silence. The prophet had enemies who wanted to destroy him. They had every motivation to discredit him in any way they could.
And they weren't shy about it.
Not at all. They called him a sorcerer, a liar, a poet possessed by jinn. They tried to slander his family. They waged war against him. They tried to assassinate him. They used every weapon at their disposal.
But they never described medical seizure symptoms.
They never did. And you have to ask yourself why. Think about 7th century Arabia. It's a warrior society. Physical strength and composure are paramount.
So if he had the falling sickness, if he was convulsing in the dirt, that would have been the ultimate propaganda weapon for his enemies.
It would have been devastating. They would have shouted it from the rooftops. Look at this man who claims to be a prophet. He's a sick man who can't even control his own body. He falls and writhes like an animal. How can you follow him? It would have destroyed his credibility instantly.
But they didn't use it.
They didn't. And their silence is deafening. Jamal cites the famous conversation between Abu Sufyan, who was his archenemy at the time, and the Roman Emperor Heraclius. Heraclius is interrogating Abu Sufyan about this new prophet.
And what does he ask?
He asks a series of very intelligent questions. Is he noble? Did any of his ancestors claim to be a king? Do the poor or the rich follow him? Does he ever lie? And Abu Sufyan, despite hating Muhammad, is forced by his own code of honor not to lie to a foreign emperor. He answers truthfully.
And what does he say about his character?
When asked if Muhammad ever lies or breaks a promise, Abu Sufyan is forced to admit, no, he never does. He didn't say, oh, and by the way, he has these weird fits where he falls on the ground. The fact that his worst enemies, when given the perfect opportunity, never mentioned anything resembling a seizure is, for Jamal, one of the strongest pieces of historical evidence against the allegation.
Okay, so we have the history, we have the clinical definition of the disease, and we have the eyewitnesses, or lack thereof. Now let's bring in the modern doctors. Section 7. Modern neurology weighs in. Because Yusuf Jamal isn't the only one with this view, right?
No, not at all. He's building on the work of others. He references several experts who have looked at this question. For instance, there's a neurologist named Frank R. Fremont who wrote a now famous paper on this back in 1976 in an epilepsy journal.
And what was his conclusion?
He completely rejected the diagnosis. He made a very brilliant point. He noted that the prophet's seizures, if you want to call them that, were always productive. They produce the Quran.
What does he contrast that with?
He contrasts that with medical seizures, which are inherently destructive, or at best, meaningless. A seizure scrambles information in the brain. It doesn't create coherent, complex, new information. He said it was like comparing a symphony to a burst of static.
That's a powerful analogy. Who else?
There's a more recent neurologist, Professor Hassan Aziz, who published a study in 2019. He went through the specific claims, the ringing bell, the sweating. He concluded these were likely metaphors for the intensity of the spiritual experience, or perhaps physiological signs of intense concentration, but certainly not TLE.
And did he mention the postictal state?
Yes, that was the absolute deal-breaker for Aziz, too. He stated that the complete and total lack of any mention of postictal confusion makes the diagnosis of epilepsy medically untenable. Full stop.
We also have the historian William Montgomery Watt mentioned in the book.
Right, and Watt isn't a neurologist, but his perspective as a leading Western historian of Islam is very important. He basically argues that calling it epilepsy is intellectually lazy. It's a way of explaining away the phenomenon.
What does he mean by explaining away?
He means you're taking something extraordinary and trying to force it into an ordinary, familiar box without any real justification. You're not explaining it, you're dismissing it. It's a convenient label that stops you from having to engage with the actual content and impact of the man's life.
And finally, Dr. Maurice Bucaille.
Bucaille was a French physician who became famous for his book on the Bible, the Quran, and science. He focused on the text. He argued that the absolute coherence of the Quran, its lack of contradiction despite being revealed over 23 years, is fundamentally incompatible with a post-seizure state. You simply cannot write a book like that while your brain is rebooting from a massive electrical storm.
So we have a consensus among the modern experts who have seriously studied it. The diagnosis doesn't fit.
That's the case Jamal presents.
Yes. So if the medical evidence is so weak and the historical evidence contradicts it, that brings us to the final section, Section 8. Why does this theory persist? Why are we still talking about it in the 21st century?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If the case is so poor, why won't it die? Jamal identifies a few key drivers here. First, and probably foremost, there's ideology. He calls it a psychological need to reduce the divine.
Back to pathological materialism.
Exactly. If your worldview has no room for God or divine revelation, then you have to find a natural explanation for religious phenomena. And brain glitch sounds scientific. It sounds modern. It becomes the default answer for the materialist. It's the science of the gaps, filling in what you don't understand with a plausible-sounding pathology.
And it's useful, right? It has a polemic utility.
Absolutely. For missionaries from other faiths, or for secular atheists who are trying to debunk Islam, he was epileptic, is an incredibly convenient and powerful weapon. It delegitimizes the entire religion in one simple sentence.
It frames the entire faith as the byproduct of an illness.
Precisely. It allows you to dismiss the Quran without ever having to read it or engage with its arguments. You just say, oh, that was just the symptom of a seizure. It's a debate ender.
There's also just plain ignorance?
A huge amount of it. Misunderstanding the Arabic language and its metaphors. When the prophet says revelation is heavy or like the ringing of a bell, a literal-minded modern critic takes that as a medical symptom rather than a linguistic metaphor for an overwhelming spiritual experience.
They're tone deaf to the poetic language of the time.
Completely. And then finally you have the engine that keeps all of this alive. The internet.
The online echo chambers.
Exactly. You see these theories, which were formulated by 19th century Orientalists with a colonial agenda and a primitive understanding of neurology, being endlessly recycled on blogs, forums, and YouTube videos.
And they're presented as if they're cutting-edge science.
They're presented as fact. They'll quote William Muir from the 1860s as if he were a modern brain surgeon, completely ignoring the fact that modern neurology has looked at the case and rejected the diagnosis. Old, debunked ideas never really die. They just find new life on the internet.
So let's wrap this up. After walking through the history, the medicine, and the evidence, what is the final verdict from our deep dive into this book?
Yusuf Jamal's conclusion is pretty definitive. The epilepsy hypothesis, when subjected to rigorous scrutiny, fails on three distinct fronts.
The first being?
It fails the medical test. The reported signs are inconsistent with epilepsy, and the crucial diagnostic markers like loss of consciousness in the postictal state are completely absent.
Second?
It fails the historical test. There are no eyewitness accounts of actual seizures from either his friends, who would have been concerned, or his foes, who would have been delighted to use it against him.
And third?
It fails the literary and cognitive test. The product of these episodes, the Quran and the Prophet's high-functioning life as a leader, are incompatible with the cognitive decline and chaos associated with chronic, untreated epilepsy.
So where does that leave us? If it's not epilepsy, what was it?
Well, the book doesn't try to prove the theological claim. It's a work of refutation. It's about what it wasn't. But it leaves us with the author's final thought, which is an invitation. He invites the reader to shift from pathologizing a historical figure to trying to understand the actual impact of his life and legacy.
So instead of looking for a diagnosis to explain it away, you have to actually engage with the phenomenon itself.
Right. A sick brain doesn't usually build a global civilization that lasts 1,400 years and continues to shape the lives of billions. At some point, the theory that it's all just a symptom becomes less plausible than the phenomenon it's trying to explain.
It's a fascinating look at how we try to fit history into our modern boxes. We have a medical manual, so we try to diagnose a 7th century prophet, but sometimes the box just doesn't fit.
Exactly. And Jamal's ultimate point is that relying on primary sources, actually looking at what the texts say rather than what we want them to say, is usually the best cure for these kinds of long-standing historical theories.
Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive, a really fascinating journey into a historical and medical cold case. Big thanks for guiding us through the neurology and the history.
My pleasure. It was great to unpack it.
And to you, the listener, here's a final thought. The next time you come across a confident diagnosis of a figure from the distant past, maybe take a moment. Ask yourself, who were the eyewitnesses? And do the symptoms actually match the disease? See you next time.